So in this video, I'm asking 5 highly qualified experts one of the most important questions in fitness. How hard should we train? So Mike, I was going to pose you the question that I've been posing to everyone else. How hard is it that we should be training in the gym?
Okay. I'm ready. Are we recording yet?
How hard should we be training in the gym?
As hard as you need to.
That is honestly, it's a really difficult question.
That is as succinct as I can get.
Yeah, that was amazing. Now, just to quickly make sure everyone's on the same page, there are 2 terms you'll need to know to keep up. RPE stands for rating of perceived exertion, and it basically just ranks how hard a set was on a scale of 1 to 10. So an RPE of 10 means you had 0 reps in reserve, an RPE of 9 means you could have got 1 more rep if you pushed it all the way to failure, and so on. And then RIR stands for reps in reserve, and it's basically the inverse of RPE. So a 0 RIR means you had 0 reps in reserve, and that would be the same as saying RPE 10. An RIR of 1 is the same as RPE 9, and so on. So up first, I spoke with Dr. Mike Isratel, and he explained to me his basic philosophy that even though it might be tempting, we shouldn't always train as hard as possible because we need to consider how fatigue from going too hard might impact future training sessions.
A lot of folks will say you got to train hard enough to make gains, and that's true. That's true as far as it goes. If it doesn't go far enough, I think we could do a little bit better. We can say you have to train hard enough to make gains, but not so hard that your next workout suffers and it becomes a situation where your next workout is unable to make you gains because you went too hard.
Then throughout our chat, he emphasized that it ultimately depends on where you are in your training phase or mesocycle, where at the beginning of a 4 to 8 week training program, you should train less hard and with lower volumes. But then toward the end of a mesocycle, you should train very hard and with more volume.
And we can get a little bit more technical as to what it means to train hard enough to make gains. I'm going to start at a load that gets you, somewhere close to 3 reps in reserve. And then as far as volume, you want to start towards the lower end of the number of sets. That's probably a volume where, you get notably fatigued in the target muscle. You don't want to leave the gym and be like, my biceps feel 100% fine. It's probably not stimulative. I wouldn't bet that it's stimulative. You probably want to get a small pump. If you get a massive pump, it'll probably come with a ton of soreness at the front end you may not want. But no pump at all is curious, unlikely to stimulate hypertrophy, at least nearly optimally. And you probably want to get, maybe like a little bit sore, at most a little bit sore. You start roughly 3 reps in reserve, and then every week after that, during your accumulation phase, you're going to increase something a little bit. It's some combination of increasing load and or reps, more or less every session that you do the same thing every week. And you want to make sure the load and rep increases maintain or reduce RIR by roughly 1 each week. So that means you could potentially do your next week 3 RIR, your next week 3 RIR, your next week 3 RIR. That's a fine way to train. But if your next week is 2 RIR, and then the one after is 1 RIR, and then the one after is 0 RIR, that's totally cool too. What you don't want is a situation in which you're not adding enough reps and load each week, and what ends up happening is your reps in reserve actually go up. So you don't want to start at 3 RIR and then end up at 4 RIR the next week and 5 reps in reserve the week after, because you're actually training easier and easier each week relative to your body's capabilities and outside of the realm of where best adaptations are had. When your repetition strength flatlines and then takes a dip, you've reached your maximum recoverable volume for that last week. That means adding any more volume or even staying at that volume is going to be more and more deleterious to gains, and it's probably not a good idea to keep going. Your fatigue is very high. You want to take a deload, decrease all that fatigue, and then come back and realign everything just like you started. 3 RIR again, lower end of volumes again, and then progress through, and that's how training sort of naturally builds itself.
Now, later in our conversation, I asked Mike exactly why he doesn't like to take any sets to failure early on in a training phase. So what's the downside of just taking, say, the last set of each exercise to failure, even in the first week of a program? And it led to a very informative discussion.
If you're going to have failure as making the biggest difference in your growth, it's almost certainly true that you don't need that difference at the beginning of a mesocycle. You just had a deload. You just traded in some exercises and traded in some rep ranges for some others. The novelty is so great, your sensitivity for growth is so great, almost certainly get great results in the first week by going shy of failure. You just don't need to go that hard. Now, could you say the same thing about the last week? For example, if you said, now Mike, everything in the last week I ever do, I always stop at 1 RIR. I never try to go to true failure. Are there downsides to that? That I would agree with you 100%. There are hypothetical downsides. There could be some magic, especially delayed growth, especially in the advanced, that is there between that 1 and 0 RIR. So I would say in the last week, if the doesn't come crashing down on you like a squat or a bench, and even if you have a good bench spotter, go all the way to failure is a really, really good idea to make sure you check all the boxes. I just don't understand why you would do that in week 1, because you're getting great gains anyway, not having to try that hard. Now, if failure training is fun, sweet, get up. Just make sure it's not poisoning you fatigue-wise for the next session. You don't want to be in a situation where you're needlessly cutting your volume and you're getting a little pings and dings and getting hurt a little bit much, and you're like, man, tell you what, I always get hurt on that stupid failure set. Why the hell am I doing it? Then if you can't justify it, I wouldn't do it then.
So for Mike, how hard you should go mainly depends on where you are in your program. Next, I spoke with IFBB Pro John Meadows, and he really emphasized that how hard you should train mostly depends on how advanced you are, with the grueling, high-intensity techniques he's most known for being most useful for helping advanced trainees break through training plateaus.
When you start training, I think we all realize that you don't have to kill yourself. You don't need to take sets to failure. You don't need a crazy high amount of volume. Just by learning proper form, you just continue to get stronger and stronger. You make nice little incremental increases in strength. But that only take you so far. Wouldn't it be great if that's how training was all the time? You could just kind of add 10 pounds on the bar for the rest of your life. And then by the time you're 60 years old, you could bench 1,200 pounds. But that's just not how it works. So you kind of move into an intermediate stage where it's like, okay, now I feel most of these movements pretty good. It's not as easy to get as strong now. Now I'm going to add a little bit of volume. I'm going to add a little bit of intensity. The primary goal with that phase, I think, is still trying to get a little bit stronger, though. It's just because you've kind of went out of that newbie gain phase, it doesn't mean all of a sudden now you don't care about progressing your lifts. You get to this advanced stage, now all of a sudden you've got to challenge your body more. So some of those techniques that we like to use, an occasional cluster set and an occasional drop set, maybe you start putting one of those in a workout, going back to our chest example. Now maybe you get on a machine and now maybe do a cluster set to finish your day, or maybe you do a drop set to finish your day, something to really challenge the muscle. I always hesitate in saying this, but I really believe it. So you're probably going to get a lot of people that get really angry at me for saying this, but I think that when you hit an advanced stage, I think you could literally use any exercises you want in any order you want, as long as those exercises work for you, as long as you just take them a certain amount of them to failure or failure and beyond. Because if you just look at muscle growth, it's mechanical tension. Okay, if you're using an exercise that gives you mechanical tension, you're probably going to grow. And that's where you see the advanced guys can sometimes use those techniques to do really, really well. In particular, naturals. The drug-aided guys have a lot of chemicals that can help them continue to break through plateaus, but the natural guys in particular, if they can kind of sprinkle some of that stuff in, it's really good for them to continue to grow. It doesn't really matter what exercise it is, as long as it's one that you feel working well, and as long as you get good activation, good mechanical tension, and exhausting the muscle fibers. Like if you're doing those three things, what else are you going to do to make a muscle grow? Like that's what muscle growth is. I mean, that's really kind of the crux of it. You find an exercise that works well for you, and you just push it hard.
John also emphasized the importance of form, even in advanced stages, and that training harder shouldn't come at the expense of excessive technique breakdown.
And I think it's important to continue to work on your form. You get a guy like you and I, we've been training for a long time, but even we still try to work on our form. So it doesn't mean that you all of a sudden stop thinking about your form and things like that.
Now, I also wanted to get a truly elite-level athlete's viewpoint, so I spoke with 25-time world record-holding powerlifter Dr. Steffi Cohen, and while she also continually emphasized how important individualization is, I think more than anyone else, she highlighted that if you want to be the best, you simply need to learn to push your limits.
So from my own experience, what I've seen is that the best people in the game, like great accomplishments and great athletes, come from working obsessively. Like you don't achieve greatness from casual effort. Never once in my entire career did I come into the gym thinking about what's the least I can do to get by. For the most part, and this is based on what I've observed, people rarely train hard enough. And they're usually in what I call the 50% zone, where they don't take themselves to not failure, but to an intensity that is actually challenging. Ever, rarely, and then they don't rest when they're supposed to rest. So it's like you end up being in this 50% zone where you're always half-assing all of your workouts because you're not training hard enough when you should, and you're not resting when you should. We need to push our athletes and ourselves to improve their confidence and really, really push for those adaptations so that they know how to respond to hard challenges. And this needs to be obviously done in an intelligent way.
Steffi also said that while she doesn't take every set to failure, she will run relatively lighter accumulation phases, training to failure is still a very central aspect of her programming.
Training to failure is an integral part of strength training that, for the most part and most recently, has been underlooked. Your training should reflect the specificity of what you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to improve your 1 rep max squat, you better be trying to train at those intensities. I'm not saying that you're gonna max out every day, but you should be challenging yourself almost every training session so that you can train your nervous system and your body to respond to the demands of putting something that's really, really heavy and having to move it up and down. Obviously, there you go through accumulation phases as well. So it wouldn't be fair to just discard completely the idea of high volume and low intensity. I think there's a time and place for that. But once you've gone through like your 4, 6, or 8 weeks of kind of introductory period of accumulating some load and fine-tuning your movement, once that's done with, now that's go time. Like, you better spend 4, 6, or 8 weeks really pushing yourself as hard as you can in those intensity ranges. Like, get to 90, 95, 100% in your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rep max and really challenge yourself. So, if your goal is to just train for health, forget about everything I just said. If your goal is to see how strong can you get, how big can you get, if you're really trying to test your limits, then you're gonna have to put in some effort and some intensity.
Steffi also said that to get the most out of your training, it's important to blend wisdom from successful athletes, coaches, and the scientific literature. So next, I got Dr. Eric Helms on the line as someone who did his PhD dissertation on this exact topic.
This is, I would say, one of the few constants in hypertrophy training. If you are not registering an RPE of 6 or higher most of the time, you're probably not going to be growing very effectively. Mm-hmm. It has to be reasonably close to failure or reasonably heavy, which kind of forces you close to failure immediately, and then do a lot of sets to compromise for the fact you're doing low reps. Mm-hmm. So on a per set basis for hypertrophy, it should probably be challenging for your work sets. Somewhere in the range of a 5 to 10 RPE, depending on what your current goal is. Most of the time, we're talking 6, 7, 8, 9 kind of thing. Because in the end, we're trying to get mechanotransduction, right? Mechanoreceptors in the muscle need to sense tension for us to start growing from resistance training. Mm-hmm. So if a high level of tension needs to be achieved relative to what our current tension adaptations are, we have to feel that. It has to feel like a high level of tension. That can be pushing a low load set reasonably close to failure, or that can be putting 80% on the bar and doing, it could be triples if you want. If you really want to do 7x3, go for it. Right. But you'd probably rather do 4x6,
Right. I'm going to put a question to you now that we've been debating forever. Not me and you, but just in the community. And,
sure.
There's this idea that you want to be leaving some reps in the tank, speaking for hypertrophy now, so that you can accumulate more volume. Then you have other people saying, well, it actually works the other way. You need to go pretty hard and get close to failure, and it'd be worth it to slash some of those sets off if you're getting fatigued that way. Is there one that you put above the other?
I think it almost necessarily must be somewhere between those two extreme positions. And not just because I'm trying to be the political guy who's the right and the left are both morons, I'm so smart. But it's more because if we think about what the actual adaptation we're trying to get is, it's the overlap of those two positions, right? If we ramp up the per set stimulus, we increase the total amount of recovery we need, and we necessarily either reduce the frequency, the volume, or we have lingering central fatigue on subsequent days because of high levels of muscle damage, which create a feedback loop, not allowing us to tap into some of those high threshold motor units, and we go to the gym and we just can't turn all the shit on. So we have to balance those two things. How do we get an effective stimulus when we train while still allowing us to come back and put in an effective stimulus the next time? So it almost necessarily has to be in the middle, and there's probably a huge continuum of what's equally effective if you do it intelligently. Mm-hmm. And that's why you can have people on the more intensity side of the spectrum or volume side of the spectrum who are winning titles, because it probably doesn't make enough of a difference to be a limit to the actual practical outcomes within a given range of that continuum.
And to put all of this together, I thought research reviewer Greg Nuckols had a really succinct way of summarizing pretty much everything we currently know about the in-the-trenches coaching stuff and also the scientific data. So I'm going to let his summary round out the video.
All right, so if I sound robotic, almost as if I'm reading off a script, that's because I am. So it really depends on the lifter, the exercise, and what you're hoping to accomplish. And you can look at it kind of from two different perspectives, both how hard should you push each set, and also kind of how much training volume should you be doing. So I'm going to start with the former. For pure hypertrophy training, I think your best bet is generally to be pretty close to failure. So for lifts like squats or deadlifts where form breakdown could cause issues, I think it's worth terminating a set at the point of technical breakdown. For lifts like rows, where you can get way more reps if you allow for the use of momentum, I think it's generally worth terminating a set when you're no longer feeling the movement in the muscles you're specifically trying to target. So, if rows become more biceps and lower back than lats, that's probably when you want to cut it off. Otherwise, I think you should generally be within 2 or so reps of concentric failure. So that's for hypertrophy. For strength work, I think there's value in doing sets near failure so you get comfortable grinding, but I also think there's value in doing a bunch of lower stress sets with 3 or more reps in reserve in order to practice skills and perfect motor patterns. And so kind of which direction you go there is going to largely depend on the lifter's skill, the lift being trained, how far you are from a meet, variations in the individual lifter's capacity to recover from near failure sets, etc. And then, like I said, the other factor for how hard should you train is kind of how much volume should you be doing. And I'm kind of approaching that on a per session basis. So I think that depends very heavily on just the individual lifter's tolerance for volume, but also what type of training they're doing and their exercise selection. So for example, if they're doing those strength-based sets with 3+ reps in reserve, they can probably do way more sets than if they're doing hypertrophy training, doing say leg press to failure. As a general rule of thumb though, I think you can kind of base this on how you feel when you're leaving the gym. So I think you should be fatigued but not completely exhausted after most workouts. And I also think kind of recovery can give you some information about whether you're training hard enough. So I think your muscles in general, kind of painting with a broad brush, should be more or less recovered within about 3 days after your training session. So if your muscles feel totally fresh 1 or 2 days after your training session, you probably should have done more volume unless you're intentionally trying to train with very high frequencies. But if you're still really sore and fatigued 4 days after a workout for the muscles you just trained, I think that generally indicates that volume was probably a little bit too high.
Awesome. That was extremely succinct.
That is as succinct as I can get.
Yeah, that was amazing. So in making this video, I spent about an hour speaking to each of these people about how hard you should train. And because there was so much amazing info, including a lot of stuff that sort of went off topic, I decided I'm going to upload the full-length conversation with each guest to my podcast, which I'll link down below. Now, it might take me a while to get all of them edited and uploaded, but if you go subscribe on iTunes or Spotify, you can make sure you don't miss those full conversations. I also have all the guests' YouTube channels linked down below. They all put out amazing content regularly, so make sure you guys go and subscribe to them. I hope you guys found the video helpful. Don't forget to leave me a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys all here in the next one.